Hi, well, welcome to an Electricity Brain Trust informal discussion meeting on the new NREL study. I'm Jim Lazar, one of the founders of the Electricity Brain Trust. My co-founder, Ahmed Faruqi, is unable to join us, but I'm sure he'll watch the reruns. Our guest today is Dr. Wesley Cole from National Renewable Energy Labs. I'm a firm believer in starting meetings on time, out of respect for those that show up on time. So I'll start with what got me jazzed about this study and then turn it over to Dr. Cole. And as people join over the next minute or two, they won't miss his stuff. This is the graphic that got me motivated to read the whole study. It tells me that getting to 80% renewables is really cheap, that getting to 95% is quite affordable, even on an incremental cost basis. And going above 95% gets quite expensive for the last few percent. When I looked at this, I said to myself, well, let's work on getting to 80% now and figure out the last 20% tomorrow or the day after. I found it interesting that very little storage is needed in the current decade. I assume that's because the remaining fossil energy on the system can provide the flexibility we need. The study has a high growth, low growth, and high electrification scenario. Each of them involves a lot of increase in electricity consumption. This slide knocks my socks off. The cost of the scenarios in dollars per ton of CO2 is negative up to the 90% renewables level. As Amory Lovins has put it, a free lunch is good, but a lunch you get paid to eat is even better. The electrification scenario is important to me as a co-author of RAP's 4-part series on beneficial electrification. This scenario involves a 5 times increase in electric space heat, a 2 times increase in electric water heat, and a 76 times increase in electrified transportation. Load flexibility is important, as I addressed 7 years ago in my booklet, Teaching the Duck to Fly, and others have done a lot more rigor to load flexibility since then. The 3 scenarios are 4%, 17%, and 34% load flexibility, with up to 100% transport electricity demand being flexible. There's a DC grid overlay proposed that to be achieved in the first decade. I know we have members who will be enthusiastic about this piece. And with that, I've wasted a couple of minutes waiting for folks to get hooked up. I'll let Dr. Cole introduce himself. He certainly knows himself better than I know him. And after he does some introductory comments, we'll open things up to questions. If things are still going strong at the top of the hour, I may leave the Zoom room open for a while. Dr. Cole.
Okay, cool, thanks. It's fun to be here. Yeah, so I guess a couple of background pieces here. So yeah, this is a study we've done at NREL over the last. This has been a long study in coming. We started this about 3 years ago. I mean, this is one where I think there's 3 different interns on the paper, because every summer I would hire an intern to help out, and it took us 3 summers of interns before we got to the final product. So there's been a lot of pieces that have gone into this. It's been quite a fun thing to work on. So just for context here, just so you know where we're coming from. So we are modeling electricity. Oh, I put renewable energy on the slide. That's a mistake. We tried really hard to be clear we're doing electricity, and here I put renewable energy just here on the front. So we want renewable energy for electricity for the United States. We're using an electricity only model when we're doing this. We're not doing full energy economy, and there's a whole bunch of caveats and things you have to that come into play when you do electricity versus the energy. We wanted to really take a deep dive into what it takes to get to 100% renewable energy electricity. We also are focused on renewable energy. There's a lot of things, if you talk just about carbon instead of renewable energy, there's a lot of options out there. We're not looking at things like direct air capture, biomass with CCS, like those. CCS plays a really small role in this study because we're looking at 100% renewable energy and not not just full decarbonization. So just kind of that as a backdrop. I have 11 slides I'll go through. You're welcome to interrupt me along the way, and then I'm happy to go anywhere you want. The SI for the paper was really long, so there's a lot, like we could go anywhere. I've got the paper pulled up and happy to take any direction we want. So just a couple slides set context here first. One is just where we're at with current electricity. Coal generation has been tanking. So this is electricity generation across different technology types, renewable energy at 20%. So that's kind of our baseline. That's where we're starting from, the 20% renewables. I think most of you are pretty familiar with this. And then also looking at where we're at with emissions. This is electricity sector emissions. And again, we're focused just on the electricity sector for this study. With the trend line drawn in there that if we continue along historical trends, it's not unreasonable for us to get to zero. I mean, this is, there's a lot of challenges with just following a trend. You can't extrapolate anything and get a lot of useful places, but interesting to look at that way. Then the other thing that's useful in terms of setting a benchmark, because we measure everything from a reference case, is just where are we at with a reference. And so I have here reference case scenarios from NREL on the left, and BNEF, EIA, and IEA. The different colors are the different publication years. So this is the renewable energy share on the top plot and power sector CO2 emissions on the bottom plot. So you can see what current projections look like. So all these black lines are the most recent projections out of these studies that you're in the 40 to 65% range of renewables under a business as usual case. With emissions, under 1,500, EIA is kind of the outlier here with steady emissions. Everybody else showing declining emissions over time. You could also see that more recent projections have gotten a lot more renewables in them, generally speaking. You can see EIA again making a big, they've been grouped. AEO 2020 was a big change in terms of renewable energy. So this is, in terms of where we're starting from, we're measuring everything from baseline. This is the baseline we're measuring from. In this study, 57% renewables was our starting point. The other thing in here is that we often talk about going farther and how much it changes the cost. Jim pointed out this, that you also, if you don't go as far, it also incurs cost. So one of the other things that we looked at, this was actually a follow-on paper to this one because we thought this thing was really interesting. How much does system cost change versus renewable energy penetration? The optimal amount is this solid point here. And so you could see this, how much does cost increase relative to that optimal point as you go more or less. So one is, as you have lower renewable energy costs, the optimal amount is farther, you get farther is the optimal amount of renewable energy. But then the other piece is that the left side of this could be really expensive. Not doing anything, sticking around at 20% could cost a lot of money. So, moving is still makes a lot of sense to push things ahead. So let me talk about now these scenarios of going out to 100%. So we walked incrementally from our reference case of 57% up to 100%. We did 80%, 90%, then 95, 97, 99, and 100. So we're showing that last 5% right here. And across all the cases, for this power sector piece, we're seeing, wind and solar are making up the lion's share of your generation potential here. That basically, no matter what you do, you build lots of wind and solar. And then you also build a lot of diurnal energy storage. That's also a key part of the mix. So that's what you're seeing here in terms of the generation and capacity as you're getting out to 100%. And you also get corresponding increases in losses across the board from these different scenarios. But then the piece that you see here in this this green color, let's see, get my cursor to show up right here. We're going to show that here on the next slide. This is a renewable energy combustion turbine. So it's a combustion turbine that's fired by some renewable energy fuel. It could be a biodiesel, it could be a hydrogen, it could be ethanol, whatever you're using to fire this thing. But that having something there, and this is we're not the first ones to see this. There's been other people who've been publishing on the importance of having firm capacity for this last few percent, but that it's really key that as you get out to really high penetrations, you need something that's a firm capacity resource. So you can't get there with diurnal storage. You can get there with diurnal storage and wind, solar, but it gets a lot more expensive. So having some sort of firm capacity resource really lowers the cost for that last few percent of getting to 100%. There's a lot of different ways you could get there. We're modeling this renewable combustion turbine. I mean, if you use CCS options because you're not just focused on renewable energy, that could work, or having negative emissions and leaving some gas turbines there, that's another option. But this is a key part, and that this, especially as we look at the electrification scenarios, you start to get or the peaks move generally to the winter time, and that's when you need these firm capacity resources, these renewable combustion turbines. This is a week in winter in Florida. This was a 2010 winter. This was one of the, I think this was an outlier event. At least it was in 2010. I don't know if it still counts as an outlier now. But you have a couple of days with low solar. You have really high load from heating demands, and you're importing as much as you can. So this bottom line is showing interconnection into Florida. Positive means you're importing, negative is exporting during this time. When you have the low solar, you're importing at maximum capacity across the lines. You get really constrained. It's these winter periods that really create challenges to meet load. But this doesn't happen every winter. So here's Texas, two different, same week out of 2 different years, 2007. It was a stressful time for the system that we're modeling here. That you have high load relative to low solar. 2013, you have the same pretty high load. The total load is about the same, but you have a lot more solar resource during this week. Makes it a lot easier to ride through the event. And you can see even you're curtailing energy here. This gray is curtailment. So there's a lot of weather pieces, and this is, I think, in my mind, one of the areas where there's still a lot of work to do. And then to the chart that Jim really liked here. So we looked at costs and how costs change as you walk up from your reference case up to 100% renewables. So the costs are going up. I mean, that's not surprising. You also get the benefit of lower emissions. So you're not paying for this for nothing. You get the benefit of fewer emissions. When we translate that to an abatement cost, we get this really nonlinear increase in this kind of marginal cost. And then the average cost goes up a lot more gently, because, I mean, if you think about it, if you're only changing the last 5%, your denominator can only you're only changing so much of the system. So even if it costs a lot to change that last 5%, it's only 5% of the system. So the average costs aren't as impacted by these really high marginal costs. We've certainly seen
Wesley, I think we've lost your audio. Wesley, we have lost your audio. Wesley, I stopped your screen sharing because we've lost your audio. That's all. You may need to switch back to computer audio. Wesley, I stopped your audio because I stopped your video because we lost your audio.
The last thing we heard was about the movement of average cost as a result of marginal cost being very high.
Thanks, David. All right. Wesley is reconnecting to audio. You can unmute yourself.
Do you hear me now?
We hear you now. Great.
Okay.
Go ahead and reshare your screen, because I was having trouble getting your attention by trying to break into the audio, so I used the sledgehammer.
Yeah, that works. That works. So apologies. So do you want me to go back, or did looking at my slides is sufficient?
Yeah, you need to go back about a minute and a half.
Okay, tell me which slide you want me to go back to. Do you want to start here? Were you good with this? We're good here.
You need to share again.
Oh, sorry. This is.
Yeah, I busted you up.
Yep. No, we're good. Sorry. Yeah.
One more forward.
Okay. Perfect. Okay. Well, apologies, but
There we go.
thanks, Jim, for getting us corrected here. So yeah, this was a slide Jim liked, or at least one of the figures. This is one of the figures that goes with what Jim likes. Looking at the costs as we go from a reference case 57% up to the 100%. You get the cost going up, but you don't, you get emissions benefits. So it's not just, you're not just paying for something for nothing. And that gives you these nonlinear cost increase on a marginal basis. Average cost doesn't increase as fast. And I think that makes a lot of sense. You're changing the last 5% of the system. There's not as much to change. So if you take that 5% and spread the cost around the rest of the system, it's not going to impact your overall cost as much, even if that marginal cost is pretty high. So this was really fun to look at. You can cap these costs. I mean, again, we're looking at renewable energy only systems, so there's only renewable energy options for abatement. If you start adding in CCS or other options, this marginal cost won't get up quite so high. You have other options to try and cap the abatement cost there. So another piece that we did as part of this study was try to look at a lot of scenarios. So that's what this slide is showing, that we have each of these down this list is a different scenario that we considered. Anything in black means that it's a 100% renewable energy scenario. So that sensitivity reached 100% renewables. If it's blue, something like nuclear counts, it's not a true 100% renewable energy scenario. We let other things happen. We're like nuclear and CCS count. We have some emissions still because not all the CCS emissions are captured. Or even things like we changed the requirement to be more like an RPS today, where it just applies to the end use load. So on a total generation basis, you're not at 100%. You could count it as 100% because of your counting. So you'll have more emissions, but it's the lower cost to get there. So it's a lot of people, that's cheating or whatever, but there's depends on how you want to define something. So across the scenarios, we measure everything against its own baseline cost. So the scenario that's high renewable energy cost scenario, we measure it against a no renewable energy penetration requirement, high renewable energy cost scenario. And we look at how the total system cost changes as we increase the penetration requirement. This is reflective essentially of the average cost. So it goes up. So in the reference case, your average cost is 29% higher than a reference case at 100%. But its shape isn't as nonlinear on this kind of average basis relative to other cases, or to the marginal case. So there's a lot we could talk about here. I didn't know where you guys wanted to go, so I'm happy to go any direction you want. But the summary is that yes, marginal costs get really high, especially for a renewable energy system. Average costs don't get that high. What counts as high and what doesn't is kind of how much you care about carbon emissions. If you don't care at all, then why would you pay anything to lower carbon emissions? If you care a lot, then maybe these costs don't seem that bad to be paying. So, but happy to go any direction here you want.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. That's a great introduction. I'm going to ask one quick question and then ask Kyle Datta and Amory and David Moskowitz and Ralph to come in right behind me if they've got questions. My question is it has to do with the renewable energy combustion turbine, sort of a big part of the last 5%. I'm assuming that up to 95%, those are combustion turbines that are running on methane, and it's the substitution of renewable fuel that drives the cost soaring. Is that accurate?
It's both, yeah. So we do allow existing turbines to be upgraded, and then so that does help with the cost. Not all turbines are upgraded. The biggest cost is that renewable fuel. Our baseline cost was $20 per million BTU for that renewable fuel. So at that, at like some of the less efficient turbines, you're not willing to upgrade, you'd rather build a new one to get improved heat rate. But yeah, that's what drives a lot of the cost. But it's just this, you have a really low utilization rate. And this is the same issue that you run into all the time. If you have something and you only use it for a small fraction of the year, the marginal cost of that unit is pretty high.
Okay. So I'm going to go to Kyle next. If you want to ask a question, turn on your camera and unmute yourself, and you'll pop up at the top of my screen as you turn on your camera. If you don't have a question, please turn off your camera and you'll sync down on the screen. And I see Kyle is ready to go. So Kyle Datta.
Dr. Cole, thank you so much for taking the time and doing the study that helped us all think quite hard about this question. So I have two questions. The first is just in terms of establishing baseline, where you're starting from must have a certain dollar per ton CO2 cost that you're adding to incrementally as you go up, and just to know where your baseline is starting from, so we're clear. And then secondly, if I read the footnotes correctly, you chose not to, in this set of modeling runs, necessarily use the excess renewable energy from all the wind and solar you created in any variety of different constellations, whether it was sort of long duration storage that's geologic case or a case or anything you like, or whether it's the hydrogen versions that, but there seem to be many terawatts of excess energy that weren't being used. Therefore, your substitution was essentially using whatever new biomass molecules you had to pay for in the CTs. So just talk to us a little bit about both of those, just where the baseline is, we understand, we can level set, and then how to think through all this additional surplus renewable energy.
Good question. So the baseline we're using is basically our regular business as usual scenario. Just put in all current policies, put in a reference case, cost projections, let the model choose whatever's least cost. That gets us to the 57% renewable energy penetration on a national basis. There was no carbon price in that. I mean, we have things like, California's carbon policies and RGGI, that's pretty light in terms of its carbon abatement. And then, all we did in terms of how we modeled these was we just put a constraint in the model that said thou shalt get to 80% on a national basis. That was and then we calculated the carbon abatement cost by looking at the change in system cost and the change of carbon, and using that to effectively post-process what the observed abatement cost is in those scenarios. So we weren't putting in an abatement price because we were looking specifically at renewable energy scenarios and not just at carbon. And a lot of that, almost all of our work now focuses around carbon rather than renewable energy. We were constrained in some ways by the goals and objectives of the last administration. It was really hard to do anything that there wasn't any interest on carbon. They were okay with us framing it as a renewable energy study and not as a carbon study.
So then the second question is really around, I think it was buried in the footnotes, the way the model worked is you didn't use the excess energy. So any excess wind or solar produced from all these terawatts was essentially not used to address the sort of last mile 5% question.
So let me talk to that one a little bit. So here's a figure showing the losses, the amount of losses in the different scenarios. So if you're looking at there's a lot. So you could total grid was something like 6,000 terawatt hours. So the curtailment here is in the yellow color. So you do have hundreds of terawatt hours of wind and solar generation that's being unused. So the reason we didn't model this is just because we didn't have the capability yet in terms of we've added that since publishing this paper and have done more stuff with that. But this was a capability limitation for why we didn't do it. We did, because it is really important, we did post-process stuff and say, well, how much could you use, what would it take, and what we found was that if you want to recover half this curtailment with electrolyzers, making hydrogen, you'd have to run those at a 20% capacity factor. So that'd be that's pretty low capacity factor. So this curtailment spread out both spatially and temporally. So it's hard to collect a lot of it. So half of it is 20% capacity factor. If you capture a third of it, you could get a 40% capacity factor out of your electrolyzer. So there's a trade-off between, how cheap could you get your electrolyzers to be able to run at those capacity factors, and how much you could aggregate these. So at least what we've seen is that the results are pretty consistent. We think you would definitely get some savings in terms of avoiding some fuel. On a marginal basis, we still see the same marginal cost of the fuel once we have endogenously represented the curtailment recovery option. So the fuel is still about $20 per million BTU, but it depends on how you're going to pay for that. Like if everybody gets that $20 market price, then it doesn't matter. But if you're, a vertically integrated utility and the first little bit is really cheap and it's really the last little bit you have to pay 20 for, well, then it's not as expensive because you're buying some of it at 5, some of it at 10, some of it at $20 per million BTU, which makes, your average cost maybe come down to $7, which is a lot cheaper than paying everybody 20. Does that answer your question?
It does, I guess. It sounds like what $20 a million BTU is roughly divided by that's like $2 or $3 a kilogram for hydrogen.
Yep. Yeah.
So I guess it depends on when you did it. It feels like, just as a thought process, you try to use just solely the curtailed energy and not necessarily hybridize it to say, if I sort of use that plus whatever I'm doing, how does that compare to my alternative of the $20? There's still a marginal cost. I'm not arguing the tail doesn't go up. I'm just saying, are there ways that doesn't go up as much where you don't have to rely quite so much on the biofuels given sort of what you're doing? So I understand the process, but it feels like it's just a thought process. It's probably a hybridization that would probably get you it would either get you geologically based long duration storage, which has the same essentially duty cycle, or the hydrogen version thereof, probably under the $20 per MBTU mark. That would again address the same issue with a little bit less cost. It doesn't change the fact there's going to be a slope.
Yep.
But it's still, and I don't disagree with the need. So I'll cede the floor now to other people. But thank you.
Well, Amory's popped back up on screen, so I'm going to go to Amory and then to Ralph. I suspect there's going to be some overlap between them.
Hi, Wes. Thank you for this exciting work. I have 9 dumb questions about it. And I think that might help us understand better its degree of conservatism. First, I noticed that the base electricity use in 2050 is about 5.2 petawatt hours. And that's about 1.5 times what we found with 2.6-fold GDP growth, 2010 to 50, and reinventing fire, assuming complete rather than partial electric vehicles. We found only 3,500 terawatt hours, 3.5 petawatt hours. And I'm not clear that you've done that sort of degree of sensitivity test to end use efficiency, but I would note that we didn't buy nearly enough efficiency in reinventing fire because its average delivered cost was only 1/10 the present retail tariff. So we should have bought a lot more of it. And you're buying a lot less than we did.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I feel like end use energy efficiency is one of the less well-known things across all the work we do. We just spend a ton of time like, can we get the capacity credit of wind and solar right? And we spend very little time on, can we figure out how we get more energy efficiency in the system? So I'm completely on board with that. Our energy efficiency is an underexamined space and is
Maybe we
almost certainly conservative.
to test your model with our efficiencies and see what it does. That would be fun. And I think that could also help deal with a lot of the peak loads and firm capacity needs you found in places like Florida and Texas, where you have extremely inefficient large stocks of buildings, many with electric heat. Then second, there's a lot of specific efficiency sensitivity testing to be done in the electrification of industry and mobility. For example, there's a 2 or 3-fold variation in how efficient electric cars are, and some people are pushing that now to 4 or 5-fold. And that determines, of course, how much recharging they need, and conversely, how much they can contribute through grid integration. There are huge variations in assumptions different analysts make about how efficiently industry can be electrified, and even in the efficiency of heat pumps in buildings. Is there a simple summary of your electrification efficiency assumptions that I can benchmark? Yeah, I saw the sensitivity.
Yeah, you saw. Yeah, so all that's in here are these tables that Jim showed.
Yeah, I saw those, but I got referred back to your electrification scenario. And does that have a simple table where I can find this stuff?
The efficiency levels.
Yeah.
I don't know if it had. I could check. I don't know if that's, but that's the report I would go to find this information anyway.
I think a third term of interest is materials efficiency. The next week or two at RMI, we're publishing a paper on decarbonizing heavy transport and process heat. And it synthesizes a literature on how to save at least half the cement and steel by better structural design, which had not previously been much counted. I assume that's not in your study either?
That's correct. That hasn't been considered here.
And that's complementary to the conventional ways of decarbonizing those sectors. But it helps determine, especially the use of green hydrogen and therefore your electrolysis loads. How do you handle EV grid integration, bidirectional charging?
For all of this, there's it's all single. It's just charge. There's no vehicle to grid represented here. It's all just charging from the grid.
Wow.
There's utility controlled portions of the fleet. So this in terms of this transportation sector flexibility, this is how much of the charging is controlled effectively by the utility versus.
Okay, so it's a demand response resource,
yes,
but
not a battery resource. It doesn't put energy back on the system.
Okay, that's actually a very big deal because the numbers are enormous, even at your incomplete turnover of the fleet. I think what 60-odd%. Yeah. So yeah, I would remind you, we showed some years ago how to run ERCOT entirely on renewables with no bulk storage, just using fully ice storage, air conditioning, and bidirectional EVs, and only light duty at that. Do you do now on the balancing or firming side? Do you do any heater cooled storage, and how do you handle demand response?
Yeah, so the demand response, so the heat and cold storage is also handled this demand response here in the residential commercial sectors. So these numbers that have the flexibility included in them, this is the portion of that sector's load that could be moved around based on when the model wants that electricity.
Oh, wow. So like in the commercial sector, am I reading this right? There's only 1 or 2% of flexibility out of the whole commercial load?
Yeah, the max here is only 6% of commercial load flexibility.
Okay, we would find many times that. In fact, in ERCOT, we found the demand response resources about 3 times as big as anyone had previously thought. And there are 8 kinds of it. But the more granular you get, the bigger resource you find. I'm curious whether your renewable prices are exogenous as appears, that is coming from your 2020 ATB, or whether you
Yes.
have, oh, okay. So they might be different, probably lower, if you had endogenously generated the renewable prices in a loop in your model that generate or counts the increase.
Yes, have some sort of alerting by doing feedback. Yeah, I mean, yes, it depends what you assume happens in the rest of the world and all those kind of pieces, but yet that would certainly be a factor. We do, I mean, that's why we have the low and high renewable energy costs sensitivities in here to show, well, let's say the low costs happen, and maybe that's more consistent with the learning rate based on the deployment levels we're building out.
Yeah, there's a nice new paper in Joule by Victoria et al. You've doubtless seen, that beautifully compares different models, those that endogenously generate renewable price counting increasing returns end up with a lot more renewables at much lower prices than those that do it exogenously. So that I think is another area for potential improvement. Am I right in thinking, Wes, that you're counting stranded assets as part of system cost? In other words, you're doing this on an accounting, not an economic basis?
So so anything that's already been built, like prior, so everything on the system before 2020, we're not carrying those capital costs forward. Like we basically, when a plant comes online, we pay the full cost of the plant comes into our bucket of system costs. And then you'll pay the fixed O&M and any O&M and fuel expenses as long as that plant is operating. And then once it's retired, they'll go away. So, I don't, does that, well, let me start.
Yeah,
Does
that helps. So you're not charging for already built resources when the model starts.
Correct.
On the other hand, you'll still charge the CapEx of an asset that does get stranded during the model run, or that gets in difficulty because it keeps getting forced up the low duration curve.
Yep.
Okay, and then on electrolysis, it looks like you just assumed a hydrogen price, which, by the way, is much higher than Bloomberg finds for 2030, 2040 in their April update. And you count an electrolyzer price, but are you counting that as the electrolyzers get cheap, you don't care so much about their utilization, and they could actually be a dynamic resource that operates only when the market is clearing at low, zero, or negative electricity prices. The rest of the time, you turn them off and sell demand response back to the grid. So in principle, with some saturations, you might make money on both ends. Was that counted?
Yeah. So this study didn't look at that explicitly. I will tell you. So we have done some other work here that's been looking at that, and at least what we've seen is that when we're competing steam methane reforming with CCS against electrolyzers, and I'm not an electrolyzer expert, so I just rely on our fuel cells technology office to say, hey, here's what our goals are for electrolyzers. Even with some of their aggressive electrolyzer goals, we don't see them beating out a lot of the steam methane reforming technologies for making hydrogen. So we often don't see this flexibility showing up in some of our scenarios because it's still cheaper to go the steam methane reforming route than it is to go the electrolyzer route.
Okay, well, that's very different than Bloomberg finds. So I think we need to.
Yeah, I know. So this is where it's been anyway. This is ongoing conversations with our fuel cells office too, to make sure that we're capturing things right.
I think Kyle's point is a very important one. We all tend to get stuck in our electricity silo and think about renewables built to maybe several times expected load as backup for really bad conditions. And they're cheap enough that you can afford to do that. But then we think of how they'll be curtailed. Well, they shouldn't be curtailed. They should be used to make hydrogen or ammonia to decarbonize the rest of the economy that is not yet electrified. And you've already paid for those assets on the electric reliability books. Their OPEX is damn near zero. So they're producing extremely cheap hydrogen, et cetera, which, however, can be priced at opportunity cost below fossil fuels. And that's an extra margin for the renewable developers. This is a line that Tony Seba and his co-author Adam something have developed under the rubric of superpower. I think they're right. Anyway, adding up all this and starting especially with the end use efficiency and demand response, I get the impression your model is even more conservative than I thought when I first read it. And my suspicion is that as we work through these kinds of items in refining the model and expanding the sensitivity testing, your uptick of marginal cost of abatement for the last few percent of renewables will probably go away long before we get to the bottom of the list. It'll be interesting to see.
Well, yeah, I know I've heard that from lots of different people. I don't know that that's, I feel like the last few percent is always going to have a nonlinear increase. I mean, what, you know, it sure may not get to $1,000, maybe cut it in half, it still gets to $500 a ton. But that last unit's going to be really expensive. Like no matter what the last unit is, something, you have to build something to get to that very last piece. But that's probably fine because either one, the last unit isn't worth getting, or two, you're spreading the last unit over the other 5,000 terawatt hours you're already doing, so you don't even notice that it costs more. So it, in some ways, it's kind of once you get far enough down the curve, it stops mattering that it becomes nonlinear, even though it does. You know, even though the last few are expensive.
I think it's kind of a theoretical nicety for economists, but not very important for markets. But this is an empirical question, and I think ought to be resolved by modeling, because, you know, as close as you are to this complex model, it's not necessarily going to behave intuitively. And I suspect that marginal uptick may simply be overwhelmed by the size of the other effects we've just discussed. Thank you.
All right, go on to Ralph. Arjun, did you need to interject something right here?
Yeah, I wanted to say something on the hydrogen question that Amory just mentioned, if I might. I'll be brief. So I've modeled this in Maryland hour by hour, and Amory's right. If you make hydrogen with electricity you'd otherwise curtail, you have free electricity. While the operating costs are low, of course, you pay a penalty in the lower utilization of the electrolyzer. So actually the cost is sort of a trade-off. It doesn't cost a huge amount, but the way I modeled it is you generate it in a forecourt size. So you don't have hydrogen infrastructure in terms of pipelines. You put it in the peaking stations that we have now, and you use light duty fuel cells, $100, $200 a kilowatt. I talked to the DOE about this, and that can be made to work because you don't build new infrastructure. You make hydrogen and use it on the spot, and you're making it with basically free electricity. So,
Ralph.
Wes, I agree with my distinguished predecessors entirely on the value of this work. I offer only one suggestion, and it builds on your early conversation with Amory. I think you can do more in presenting these results to underscore the importance of the energy efficiency contribution, or potentially the lack of it. For example, if you're assuming 242 million light-duty plug-in electric vehicles, it would be straightforward to compare the current fleet average, so 3 miles per kilowatt hour or so, with what Amory has documented as plausible cost-effective improvements in fuel economy for light vehicles, which is at least 3 times that. And I encourage you to look for ways to do it so that that variable isn't lost for the very large audience that's going to be taking comfort for this and taking guidance from it. And not just for vehicles, obviously, the same applies across the spectrum of end uses. I don't think you have to do a whole new set of analyses to mine what you've got to shed more light on that.
Yeah, no, that's a great comment there. So and this is where there's just so many things and go on a long time. One of the things that we've looked at, and again, a follow-on piece that isn't yet published here, but this of the pieces you're looking at in terms of how much do you save in all these other end-use sectors as well? Like, is you're not by shifting over to electric vehicles, you spend a lot less money on fossil fuels there, and you get emissions benefits there. And so there's other pieces. Again, this piece is just looking at the electricity. Once you broaden outside the electricity, there's all sorts of other really fascinating things that happen that make that can make costs get lower too. So yes, I'm totally on board there.
Mike Hogan is next. I'll remind people, if you have a question, turn on your camera. If you don't have a question, turn off your camera. That way you float up to the top of my screen and I see who's in the on deck circle. Mike?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Hey, Wesley, congratulations. Very interesting piece of work. I ran a similar study back in 2009, 2010 for Europe called the Roadmap 2050 project. So I'm, like others on this call, familiar with the challenges of doing this, and we included a lot of stakeholders in that as well, from Greenpeace all the way over to Electricité de France and everything in between, Gaz de France. So I want to echo Amory's shock at the level of flexible demand assumed here. I think it's a tremendously untapped resource in your assumptions, especially in the commercial and industrial sectors. And your work and the conversation with Amory also highlights, the answer to a question that we get asked a lot, which is, well, golly gee, if energy is going to have zero carbon content, does efficiency really matter anymore? And of course, it matters perhaps even more so than it ever has in these scenarios. But there's a red flag. My dog is all equally exercised about this. It's worth pointing out that and this gets to your, this is where the urge to conservatism tends to come, and I can understand that. Whereas in the old days, the benefits of energy efficiency and demand response, around half of it came from not running supply side resources. In the scenarios we're looking at here, nearly all of the benefit of energy efficiency and demand response, or the vast majority of it, comes from not building. And the risk there, of course, is that under the current regime in most systems, especially systems where we have centralized forward capacity mechanisms, the instinct, the knee-jerk reaction of the institutional structure is to cover a multitude of sins by just building more. And once you've done that, you've basically, for the next 20, 30 years, squeezed a lot of much lower cost potential out of the market from energy efficiency and demand response. Because once you've built it, you've incurred the cost that you were trying to avoid. So that's just something I want to flag for everybody, who, especially those who continue to think that we can centrally plan our way out of this problem. I want to get back, though. My question comes back to similar to the point Kyle made, and Amory touched on it a little bit, and it's this business of curtailment, and it connects to the fact that you have, quite reasonably a large slice of renewable energy combustion turbines in there. And of course, one of the questions I had that was sort of answered is, well, where does the fuel for that renewable energy combustion turbine come from? And I assume that your answer earlier says that most of it comes from steam reformation and not electrolyzation, because if it was coming from electrolyzation, I'm sure your curtailment levels would have been lower. But looking beyond that point, and maybe this has to do with the fact that you've only looked at decarbonizing at 100% renewables in the electricity sector, is that to get to the level of hydrogen we're going to need, not just for, if we're going to use electrolyzed hydrogen, the running of combustion turbines, but also the decarbonization of heavy industry and high temperature industries, and the decarbonization of the petrochemical and pharmaceutical industries. We're going to need to build renewables simply for the purpose of producing hydrogen. So we're talking about renewables, we're not talking about not just curtailed renewable electricity being used to produce hydrogen, but renewables being built that are being operated strictly for the purpose of building hydrogen, probably mostly solar. And I would suggest that would probably go a long way towards solving or addressing your capacity factor problem. Because if you're using the curtailed electricity from renewables that are being used primarily to produce electricity, if you're using it to top up the operation of an electrolyzer fleet as opposed to simply run an electrolyzer fleet, that would dramatically change the utilization factor of the electrolyzer fleet. So that's a question or a suggestion I would make.
Yeah, no, that's it. This is, again, our follow-on work's been looking a lot more at this in a lot more detail. And so yes, you're correct. I mean, the general idea of like, yes, you get more, these things offer a lot of flexibility. Electrolyzers offer a lot of flexibility, especially when you need non-electric sector demands for hydrogen that are, pretty constant. Like this is, you're putting this in an industrial plant, so the offtake is pretty constant. You don't have to store it. That does offer some flexibility. There's still, it still doesn't solve the problem of the last little bit of, so the last, that last megawatt that we need to meet is happening when, usually when there's not solar output or not, it's during a low renewable energy resource time. Otherwise you just build renewable energy to serve that load. So you still need something there to help ride through. And it's often a couple day event you start running into. So yes, it adds a lot of flexibility. It doesn't change the last few percent, but yeah, everything you said is right.
All right, I'm going to jump in here with a quick question and then come back around the circle to Amory and Kyle and Arjun and then back to Mike. If I can, Wesley, get you to go back to your slide on the cost range. There was, and you may need to unshare and reshare because I think you're in the report right now, but there you go. Yeah, a slide on cost range. And on the bottom right, under nuclear, it shows a substantial, it looks to me like a substantial increase in the carbon emissions. Am I reading that right? And if so, what's the deal?
Yeah, no, good question. So yes, you're reading that right. So as you start putting nuclear as it counts, that basically buys you more time to get an emissions reduction, right? So as you're working your way up to 100%, when you're at 80%, if 20% of it's nuclear, you're now 60% renewable, 20% nuclear, and now you've reached 80%. So you have more carbon emissions along the way to 100%. You'll still end at zero. So by 2050, you have zero carbon emissions. But along the way, because you get to count this extra resource that you weren't counting before, your carbon emissions there are higher. Does that make sense?
You're saying it's because the nuclear lead time is longer to build than the renewable lead time?
No, it's because, so if you're, let's say you're at 90% in 2040, you're at 90% renewables in 2040. Well, if you're 90% renewables in 2040, you still have some nuclear around because it's still part of the least cost mix. And so you actually have more than 90% clean energy. If you say nuclear now counts towards the 90%, then you don't build 90% renewables, now you only build 80% renewables, and now you have 90% clean energy. So it's an accounting thing. I mean, this is a scenario definition. outcome, but it matters in terms of how you design. If you're going to design a policy to get there, these kind of things start to have an effect. That if you count nuclear versus don't, it's a more aggressive policy not to count nuclear if you're going to end up at the same endpoint than it is to include nuclear.
Could I then jump in and ask where your nuclear numbers come from? Because the current OPEX is 3 cents average, and a learning curve has never been demonstrated, but you're assuming a steep learning curve, steeper than for renewables, I think, in your new nuclear costs.
Well, we don't see any new nuclear builds in these scenarios.
Right.
They're just existing plants
Okay.
that have, I think, average prices are, I think the average across the fleet is at $30 a megawatt hour for the operating cost. The prices escalate over time. The operating costs escalate over time in our assumptions. I don't remember exactly how much, but I just remember we have an adder that goes on every year.
Well, then I guess I'm just surprised that it could still be a least cost or a competitive resource when it isn't today, and renewables are going to get even cheaper.
Well, not all nuclear is not competitive today. There's a number of plants, but there's still I mean, just like with some coal plants are still making good money today.
It's true that there's a distribution by quartile, but the financial houses have trouble finding any that are actually profitable. That's why they're asking for subsidies.
Yes, no, I've seen that.
All right, Kyle. Then Arjun, and then anybody else, turn on your camera. I'll be coming back through mic. And Wesley has agreed to go a little beyond the top of the hour, so we don't have a hard stop. But I think I'm done with questions.
Wesley, just as a second order question. So if the problem we're solving for the last sort of 5-10% is either a combination of the multi-day problem, i.e. you have like the lulls or the stormy skies, or so you have that kind of a problem, and or you've got this sort of like long flattened peak based on sort of the joint effects of everything else, the load and the way you've done that. Is one way to look at your study, which is again a framing of it, says, look, this is the price to beat for new technology, for the technologies that are being addressed, are being designed to address this problem. That is, if you take any combination of electrolyzers, hydrogen, and both curtailed and sort of new, that whole package together, you have to get to, if you launch at this benchmark, there's a substitute. If you take any of the geologic storages, here's a substitute. Take sort of the form energy version, which who knows that's going to work or not. Here's what the price would be. But if you look at it saying, look, there's a real problem, and I agree with Amory that, of course, the more efficiency you do, the smaller the problem gets. But there'll always be this multi-day problem doesn't go away with size. It exists. It continues to exist. It's just it's the change of volatility to other volatility from fossil fuel volatility. So that real electrical engineering challenge exists. If we use your study to say, in the absence of doing anything better, we have to do this with biofuels and CTs. But if we do better, here's the price points we'd have to hit. Is that another sort of interpretation of how to use this?
Yeah, no, that's often how we approach things, because we have a lot. I mean, we work for a lot of renewable energy offices where their technologies aren't very competitive today. You know, something like a pump storage hydropower or deep enhanced geothermal systems or something like that, and we use that approach all the time in terms of here's what technology is filling this role. If you could beat the price that technology is being built at, then that you could be a winner there.
Let me add one piece of data which you probably have that's maybe not published but be very valuable. It's the same sort of stuff that sort of ENSO is working out in Europe, the transmission agency, is the type of flexibility gaps you're solving for and their magnitude. Because what you've got is probably a couple of different flexibility gaps. You've probably got some multi-day gaps that are sort of this magnitude you're solving for. You've got some other kinds of gaps you're solving for. If we had a sense of what your model is solving for in terms of the gaps, it's now putting these resources in, that tremendously helps sort of collective thinking of how do you solve the problem. Even if the magnitude shrinks because of efficiency, the kinds of gaps remain. They will remain. It's good to know what the magnitude you're looking at against this magnitude of total demand, because again, it will help all of our thinking in terms of how do we solve the problem to get to 100%, essentially.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. Yeah, great. I like that.
I'm gonna skip around here too. I just noticed Mark Cooper's had his camera on.
Yeah, I
Mark,
think,
you-
can you hear me? Did I
Yep.
did I activate my sound?
Yep, you're good.
So I mean, it's interesting. I want to start with a story about COVID, and that it's to frame this study, because this is a really important study, but you have to be very careful how it's used, okay? And you've heard there are 6 buckets of assumptions that if you change them, the outcome is very different, because you never get to that rising marginal cost, because capitalists and markets start working on that long before you get to that high number. But the study is the Imperial College study on COVID. Very famous study, and it came up with a huge number of, if you did nothing, how many people would die? And the number in the US and UK was huge. And everyone said, look at that, we never got close to that, they're stupid. They never looked at the opposite side, which was, if you did everything right, how few people would have died, right? And it turns out that in countries that are not the Asian, but Australia, New Zealand, a number of countries, Japan, and obviously South Korea, they did everything right. The number of deaths was almost 0. So the model was exactly right at the bottom, but it appeared to be way off at the top, and everyone said, oh, this is stupid, right? It turns out in most countries, people were not as dumb as their governments, even in the US. So lots of states did lots of things, and people did lots of things, and people attribute 1 million lives saved to the states. But there were also 600,000 lives lost because the federal government did nothing, which wasn't supposed to happen. In your study, so the interesting thing is that I would like to see, and Amory's laid them out, several people laid them out, you have 6 big buckets of things: efficiency, internal price determination, EVs, marginal uses, flexibility. What happens to the end result? How quickly does that stuff kick in and move the curve way out? I mean, you can pick simple observations about 1, 2, or 3 of those things, put them together, and I believe the marginal cost goes up, but it's gentle. And that's the way markets would work. Capitalists would see an opportunity, they would begin working on it because they know they can get paid. And being farmers, they overproduce stuff, right? Because they just keep producing, so the price comes down. So, and it's not as fancy as it seems. It's fairly simple to lower the demand, to increase the flexibility, those 4 or 5 basic things. Now, maybe someone else should do it. It sounds like Emery's been working on it to show, here's a baseline if you did nothing. And if you do everything, the price never goes up.
All right, let's go back to Arjun and then to Amory, and then I'll call it a wrap.
This is Penty. I'd like to interrupt for briefly. I'd like to add something later when there's an opportunity. Thank you.
So a quick thing. So I, in my modeling, which was for Maryland alone as an autarkic system, I had considerably more demand response in the residential commercial sector than you did. And I found the problem was not the last 5%, but the last 2%. So that's already a 3% improvement. So I can give you some quantitative idea if you make those numbers more realistic, what will happen, I think, at least sort of order of magnitude. The next thing is I did not model V2G, and I don't think you did either. I did have transportation demand response, but V2G is a different matter, and I regret not doing it. And I've shared with this group my recent calculation that the long-term parking slots in Baltimore Washington Airport are 70% of them would equal about 1 gigawatt. That's just the long-term parking spots in one large airport. So I think that could alleviate. Of course, you got to pay for that V2G infrastructure, which I imagine is not going to be cheap, but it might be cheaper than $500 a megawatt hour. And when you've already got the vehicles and the charging infrastructure. And the last thing I'll say is I do think that seasonal thermal storage, the way they do it in Drake's solar landing, not charging it with solar thermal, but just insulated cells in the soil to seasonally store hot and cold, I think should be a feature in our resilience. And since you charge it with curtailed electricity, the same way as we're talking about hydrogen, I think it would also, I think it's very important for resilience anyway. And since your problem hours will occur on winter nights when you've electrified heating, will be very important, especially in the upper Midwest and places like that.
All right, well, back to Amory, and Pentealto wants a few seconds here, so then we'll call it a wrap.
There's a lovely remark by Ken Caldera that uncertainty about details of the end game shouldn't unduly inhibit our opening moves. Jim, I don't want to steal your thunder, but may I make the remark that you said? Yeah, that one way to interpret this study, Wes, would be to say we ought to go flat out for 90% renewable. And while we're doing that, we'll have 10 or 15 years, maybe longer, to figure out the best way, in the light of ever expanding knowledge, to do the last 5 or 10%. We don't need to settle that now. All we need to know is that we have ample resources at reasonable cost. And the argument now is about how to make that even better, not whether it's possible. And I think your study does nail that, despite all its, in fact, it's stronger because of all its conservatisms. I just hope that they'll be made more explicit so people will realize how conservative it is. And then that will get illuminated in further work. Thanks.
Pente, you had something you needed to comment?
Yeah, thank you. I look at it sort of from a New England perspective, where my heat pump to heat my 200-year-old house uses probably 5 times as much power as I would normally use. And if I tried to get that with solar PV, I would have many times the amount of power available all summer long. Even if I got it from offshore wind, the balance just isn't there. The ability to do something with power gives us a way to optimize for producing fuels for transport through renewable processes, synthetic fuels. All of that seems to provide a lot of room to move forward. And I think the report just emphasizes that we can't really look at it this way. We've got relatively low cost coming out of the report. If we think of the whole works, we can get much, much better performance for all of these pieces. And the electricity component itself may be small. We may end up producing renewable methane that we put in the pipe someplace in the middle of the country where the grass grows, and help that with wind to produce synthetic fuels. With second law improvements in efficiency at the tail end of it, for heating particularly, we can get enormous improvements in performance. And I think we can do it at a very low cost. I haven't done the detailed analysis to look at how the differences are, but the report really helps this, because what it says is if we do all of this together, we've got so much room for cost reduction. And we can begin to think about carbon sequestration in soil for better food production. We can begin to think about using biofuels and synthetic fuels in ways that make sense to reduce the total cost of the system. We can make use of our existing infrastructure in many cases. But again, thank you very much for a very good report to begin the discussion about what do we do when we start electrifying or finding other second law improvements in efficiency that we might be able to find, particularly for space heat and industrial heat, where we don't look at second law efficiency very much. So again, thank you.
All right, Wesley, you have any final wrap-up comments before we shut this down?
Yeah, just this has been great. I appreciate all your comments. It's been really It's been really fun. And it's also been really fascinating that almost all the groups I've presented to thus far have all been very focused on the supply side of the equation. And you all have been much more focused on the demand side. It's been really fun just to have that different side of the coin. I mean, Amory's comment of like, well, we should just go to 90%, we just push renewables as hard as we can. It's like we just push renewables and efficiency while we figure out the other stuff. Anyway, this has been great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. It was very stimulating.
Thanks a lot. I did record this. I will post it to the Electricity Brain Trust channel on YouTube if I once again succeed in figuring out how to do that. Thanks to everybody who attended for being part of the Brain Trust. It's a great group of people.
Thank you very much, Jim and Wesley.